She's in the blue jumpsuit. Oh, okay. Let me go get her. Let's do it. I was told you wanted to sit, which you're very welcome to do. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to go up on stage and introduce you, and then you'll come up and you can just sit in one of these middle two chairs here. Sounds good?
Hello.
Hi.
It's on already when you start talking outside.
Okay. So you'll turn it on.
Yeah.
Got it.
When you go on stage, Lauren, then it will. That's it.
Amazing.
So, deep breaths on you go.
Ready for me to go?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go on and then I'll pull you up and then you can come on. Okay, great. We'll just trade off. And when I get up there, is that okay? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I love the enthusiasm. It's so good to see you early in the morning on day 2 of the Bloomberg Green Festival. We're really excited to have you here. We are going to have an amazing conversation while you have your breakfast, so please continue to keep eating. I want to give a big thank you to Providence, who is a sponsor of the festival and also a sponsor of this morning's breakfast. Thank you so much to the Providence team. To kick off our conversation this morning, I want to introduce Ali Santori. Ali is Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer of Providence. She's going to give us some opening remarks to help give us some intro thoughts before we have our conversation. So, Ali, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm so happy to be here today on behalf of Providence, and thank you to our wonderful sponsors, Bloomberg. This is the right crowd and the right place to be. I was telling Jessyn, one of our panelists, that I have done early morning conversations and talks on environmental stewardship and sustainability, 7:30 in the morning, and there's a total of 5 people in the room. And so you guys are the true believers, and I'm so grateful to be here. On behalf of Providence, for those of you who don't know about Providence, you don't live here, we are one of the largest nonprofit healthcare systems spanning across 7 western states. We have 51 hospitals, 120,000 caregivers, and over 1,000 clinics. That includes about 40 million square feet of carbon-intensive real estate that must run 24/7. So this panel and this conversation is near and dear to our hearts today. We are, in fact, in our hometown. We are based here in Seattle, where I can assure you it is always this sunny and beautiful. So come back whenever you'd like. For us at Providence, we realize that we have a responsibility to health and healing and advancing our mission and vision of health for a better world. But we are actually part of the problem in healthcare. The U.S. healthcare system accounts for 8.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So while we have a calling to heal, we're actually contributing to the health-related illnesses caused and exacerbated by climate change. So we are doing our best in taking on the challenge to decarbonize our facilities while they continue to operate 24/7. I'm proud to say that we have 89 facilities running on 100% renewable energy, and we've done this in a way that actually lowers costs across our system. So we're trying to get away from this concept that environmental sustainability and cost reduction are mutually exclusive. You can do one and the same at the same time. And I'm very excited today to learn from our expert panelists, including my friend Kara from the American Hospital Association, who is going to discuss a landmark engineering initiative that we have partnered with the American Hospital Association and the American Society for Healthcare Engineers to look at and determine a feasibility study for fully decarbonizing a hospital as it continues to operate 24/7 and serving patients. We don't have the luxury of shutting down any of our facilities as we do this work, so we're literally trying to build the plane in the air. And Kara is going to share how we've studied how to do this to continue to operate while also decarbonizing and reducing our emissions. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you for your engagement in this important topic. Thank you to our panelists for their expertise. And with that, I will turn it over to Lauren.
Amazing, Allie. Thank you so much. I would like to welcome to the stage my amazing panel. We're going to jump on here, and I will introduce everyone. Awesome. With me, I have Jessyn Farrell, who is the Director of the Office of Sustainability and the Environment for the City of Seattle. Donnel Baird is the CEO and founder of BlocPower. And then Kara Brooks is the Senior Associate Director of Sustainability for the American Hospital Association. So, Jessyn, I want to start with you because we're in Seattle, right? So lay the groundwork for us. As you think about Seattle in particular, what challenges are buildings up against? What challenges are organizations like Providence dealing with as they try to decarbonize their buildings and their operations?
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for filling the room. This is amazing. We love that. Welcome to Seattle. How many people traveled from other places to get here? Okay, amazing. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see all of you. And thank you to Providence for hosting this event and for being such a great partner to the city of Seattle as we're really trying to do complicated, hard things that are so important around decarbonization. So I direct the Office of Sustainability and Environment, and we are driving climate policy across a whole set of sectors. And of course, buildings are deeply important as we are trying to get to a place where we have decarbonized the city and created safe, cool places for people to be. Some of you may not know this, but this is a city that does not have a lot of air conditioning in residences. Certainly in our commercial buildings, that's not necessarily the case. But one of the key parts of the lay of the land is that this is an increasingly warm place in the summer, and for the safety of people who work and play and live in buildings, decarbonization is not just important on the climate side, but actually just for health and safety and being able to have a nice place to be when it's so hot out. So buildings are about 40% of emissions in the city of Seattle, so it's a big area of initiative for us to be able to decarbonize. And we are really excited and proud that this past December, Mayor Farrell signed into law Building Emissions Performance Standard, fondly known as BEPS, so that's what I'll be calling it today. And the idea is that we are going to work with the 4,000 largest buildings in the city, over 20,000 square feet and above, to decarbonize to net zero by 2050. And this is a really heavy lift for a lot of building owners and operators. And so we've built in a lot of ways to support our building owners and operators, but there's also a stick. You have to get to that decarbonization. And so I'm looking forward to talking about some of the very specific ways that we'll get there. But one of the key things that we heard from building owners in putting together this legislation is that building owners need flexibility. One of the challenges in any kind of regulation like this is every single building is different. So on the one hand, we need flexibility and kind of the ability to recognize the specific challenges with each building. But at the same time, we need predictability. We need a very predictable regulatory environment and standardization. So really trying to thread that needle was one of the things that was a challenge, and I think we got there for the most part with this legislation. And so just a couple other details about it, and then I'll maybe pass it on. But this particular legislation is really important because it actually will reduce emissions in the city by 10% overall. Wow. So it's one really big move, and we now only need to do that 9 more times before we get to fully decarbonized city. Right. It's not really that easy, but this particular legislation is really a signature policy in our efforts to fully decarbonize the city of Seattle. So that's one thing that I just really want to point out. I think the second thing that's really important about this legislation, that flexibility is important, and we really relied on the expertise of building owners as we wrote the legislation, particularly our partners in the hospital industry. There were several very specific things that we put in to accommodate the very specific things that hospitals have in a very unique operating environment. And so really having this deep, strong relationship with our building owners and operators in the city was one of the reasons we were able to pull together something that was relatively complicated and relatively hard to do. And so final thing I'll say is that Seattle, like everywhere else in the United States, is deeply polarized on a whole host of issues. But this was a place where we were able to find a lot of consensus. And I think that's because people across sectors, across our communities really get that climate change is happening right now. I mean, you all get to be in Seattle in the middle of what is a heat wave for us. For some of you, maybe coming from Florida or Southern California, this isn't the same. But for us, this is really warm. And it just really kind of brings to bear how immediate and current the crisis is. So we're really excited about implementing this policy, and I'm looking forward to digging in with my fellow panelists.
Donnel, I think a good amount of people here said that they traveled in from somewhere else that isn't Seattle. Can you give us a sense of how Seattle ranks in terms of other cities and some the places that you all are working at BlocPower in terms of decarbonization of buildings? Is this an easier place to do that, or are there different challenges that you face somewhere like New York, where you live?
Well, it's never easy to take any city to net zero, and it will be super important that the first 3 or 4 or 5 American cities to go to net zero, share all their learnings and best practices down to the building by building mechanical and electrical engineering analysis, the construction analysis, the energy data. We have spent about 6 or 7 years working with the national laboratories of the U.S. Department of Energy. If you saw Oppenheimer, they invented the atomic bomb. Now some of them are researching renewable energy deployment at scale and how to take buildings to net zero, with less of a focus on nuclear than you might think. And we've been working with them in the EPA to build digital twins of all 125 million buildings in America. And so you can type in a building's address and get a plan and a feasibility score for how to take that individual building to net zero, how to finance it, how to construct it, what the emissions reduction and health impact would be. And you can do that at building scale, neighborhood scale, or city scale, or state scale, right? So in effect, we've been able to build this AI model that can tell us how to take buildings to net zero and decarbonize buildings across the country. And we're now in about 51 cities, many of whom, during the Trump administration, frankly, passed legislation, like Seattle leading the way, that they want that city to be net zero by 2050 or 2040 or 2030. And so it's almost like this portfolio of approaches at the city level that we're seeing as to how these hundreds of U.S. cities are approaching their net zero goals. And some of them are making lots of progress in an awesome way like Seattle, and some of them are, have heavier lifts than others. And when we did an analysis of the building stock in Seattle, we saw 2 really interesting things. One was that buildings in Seattle, unlike New York, in New York, you gotta dig into the ground and you put your fossil fuel equipment for burning oil or gas in the basement, and then you heat up the hot water and make steam and send it through pipes and through vents into radiators or distribution systems in individual apartment buildings or rooms or hospital wings. And then the amount of fossil fuel produced heat or air conditioning or hot water is leaked through the windows and walls and roofs. But all the fossil fuel equipment is in the basement, and it was put in there 50 to 100 years ago during the Spanish flu. It's got lead and mold and asbestos. Literally, right? That's when a lot of the stuff is installed. And so in order to fix it and decarbonize it, there's these incredibly high costs of sending engineers into the basement. And you need different kinds of engineers. You need a hazardous material engineer, you need a mechanical engineer, and an electrical engineer in the basement to figure out how to rip out the fossil fuel equipment and replace it with all electric equipment. But in Seattle, many of the buildings are not built that way because of the geography, buildings in Seattle, you don't go really far down into the ground and put the fossil fuel equipment underground. It's actually above ground. It's easier to access. You can actually use satellite data to understand what's going on. And so it's actually easier on a building-by-building basis to diagnose and figure out how to take buildings in Seattle to net zero. Easy to diagnose, potentially hard to actually do it. The other thing is Seattle has such a huge reliance on hydroelectric power. So of all the cities that we're in, where we're working, and all the cities that we've analyzed, which is every city in America, Seattle's in the top, 5-10% of cities that are most likely, from an existing real estate asset and energy infrastructure perspective, to be able to go to net zero first. No pressure.
Yeah, we love
some pressure.
We love to see first.
Some pressure.
So.
But Seattle really has an opportunity to kind of lead the world and lead the country in achieving its net zero goals, and open sourcing and sharing all of the learnings and data about how thousands of other cities around the world can also get to net zero.
And Kara, a great example of that is the work that you've done with Providence that Allie mentioned. So tell us a little bit more about what she alluded to.
So we went about this study, and when we were looking at, we wanted to look at a hospital and understand what it would actually take to electrify that hospital and decarbonize, and hopefully get to carbon neutrality with that. We actually chose a hospital that was in this area. It's right down the road in Olympia, and it's St. Peter's Hospital. And one of the reasons we chose that is, as Donnel said, we had, this is a mild climate. And so we wanted to understand that if we could do this in a mild climate, what would that look like? Interestingly enough, Providence is a little ahead of the game because they've really addressed a lot of the carbon-intensive systems that are already in their hospitals. So in this particular study, we were looking at what it was going to take to electrify the heating plant and the thermal load. It was a very interesting study. We kind of went through different renditions of and phases of what it would take. Looked at everything from just changing out to another electric boiler, which is not an ideal situation, especially for electrical infrastructure, and really got to the point where we wanted to keep the demand of the electrical load really the same throughout the year. So traditionally, your electric demand is highest in the summer. Now that's going to convert to actually being in the winter. We're going to have a high electric demand. So we wanted to kind of keep within that parameter. A lot of different things that had to happen to get to that point. One, we really had to start with optimizing the building energy efficiency measures, really dialing in that building. Again, this particular hospital had done a lot of that work already and was in really in good shape with their optimization. So then we said, well, we can get the load down a little bit and get that demand down a little bit. So what would be the next step? And we started to look at the building envelope. This particular hospital had been built in 1969. It was in the Hill-Burton era. It's had other phases of renovations since, but that was when the original core was built. And we did some thermal imaging and looked and said, we're going to have to change out windows. We're going to have to add insulation. We're really going to have to work on that building envelope. And that got us a little closer. And then we start looking at heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. What's it going to take to have those be all electric? And then finally, we were really able to get there through adding some thermal storage as well. But really interesting project, just trying to have at least one case study that says this is what it would take in this type of hospital. Obviously, every building is different. Awesome. And so in different climates and different building types, they're going to be different. Somebody who's in a very humid climate and has academic medical center is going to be, they're going to have different strategies. But the great thing was we were able to actually look at it and say, what would this take?
That's awesome.
And one of the interesting things Allie mentioned too was you have to think about how to not take those facilities offline. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for healthcare. You can't just tell everybody, go work from home for a month, go get out of the building. You have to continue to operationalize, and you have to continue to do that work. So what other learnings do you have about hospitals in particular that reflect that challenge of continuing to work while you make those changes?
Yeah, as Ali said, our mission is patient care. We want to take care of our communities. We want to take care of our patients. That is why we exist as hospitals. And that does create a challenge because we can't take this hospital offline and say, you know what, for a year we're going to close the doors and not have any patients. It's just not practical. That's not our business. And so we really had to look at what that strategy would be to continue operations. And it was an interesting learning that we really looked at it, and it has a bit of a long runway to get there. We didn't want to take more than 2 patient rooms offline at a time, as an example. And so, we have over 300 beds in this particular hospital, so we didn't, you have to look at how that's going to happen. Another thing we had to look at is with mechanical systems, when you're changing things, you have to look at what is what are the outside temperatures at certain points. And you can't change systems that are going to be, cause discomfort for patients. So those were some definite challenges that we had to keep in mind. What we really learned is that in this particular hospital, it would take between 10 and 15 years to get all the way through changing out the heating plant. So it's definitely a long runway. I think a good takeaway is that the planning has to start early, especially when you're setting goals, but you need to keep that long time frame in mind as you're also setting those goals. So really fun project to be a part of.
Donnel, when you think about a long timeline like that, how do you balance the need for something that might take time with the fact that this technology is changing very quickly? And what's happening in 10 or 15 years might not be what's happening now.
And that we're all going to be burned alive in 10 or 15 years unless we get it right. Sorry. It's a dark time for our nation. Anyway, I think that, some of the challenges that you're talking about, we also run into. We started out our company to focus on greening low and moderate income communities. And similarly, in a public housing complex, you have, poor people or, senior citizens who have like a diabetes machine or life-saving equipment in their home, and they can't move, like even if there's a blackout or, like in California, where we're having these constant blackouts due to wildfires, there's a concern. There's over 1 million folks in California who cannot move during a blackout, and how do you provide them with some level of power so that they don't die? Or during heat waves, how do you keep folks alive in Las Vegas when the temperature gets 110 degrees and there's no air conditioning, right? And so there's all these life-saving concerns, particularly when you look at low and moderate income communities where they just don't have the resources to be mobile. And so you kind of have to plan the retrofit while operating the building in the way that you've just outlined. We talk about decarbonizing and electrifying buildings as like turning buildings into Teslas. But to be more accurate, it would be like ripping the fossil fuel engine out of an existing vehicle and replacing it with an electric engine while driving.
That's true.
That's what we're actually doing. We still got to operate. One of the interesting projects that we have with, I think it's with the National Research Labs from the federal government, is new technologies. Like one is called hydronic shell, where in order to fix this, you just kind of build a modular new building facade and design it with architects, and you actually embed the new all-electric heating and air conditioning and hot water equipment in the building shell, and then you just like drive it up to the building and like lay it on top of the building so the building continues to operate inside. And so the Public Housing Authority in Syracuse, New York, where it's like super cold in the winter and like there's lots of seniors who can't move and low-income people, we're actually installing one of these systems there to kind of demonstrate that even in a really rugged environment like Syracuse, how do you keep these complexes operating while trying to get these buildings as close to net zero as possible in real time? And so those kinds of technological innovations on the hardware side can really help. And I will start to look and learn about how some of these technologies could be applied to healthcare facilities, because they have to continue to operate. But there may be some innovations that could be brought to bear.
Jessyn, you mentioned earlier the importance of working with building owners as you're setting policy. How do you think about a situation like what Kara mentioned, where they have certain ways they need to operate? They may only be able to take something off, a small amount of their facilities offline at a time, versus others who may be able to do the whole thing. How do you set a policy that works for everyone?
That is a great question, and that was really the key question, I think, at the end of the day. So I'll just start by doing a really quick overview of how the BEPS regulation works, because then we can talk about how we incorporated particularly hospitals' feedback and the really special considerations. So the basic idea is that buildings get to net zero by 2050. There's a pathway A where you hit the compliance timeline starting in 2031, and then over time you're ratcheting down to get to net zero by 2050. So if you are able to hit all the timelines and do everything kind of in a standard way, you are in our A pathway. If you have some nuances, like maybe you have a restaurant that has gas heating, like cook stoves, et cetera, there are some small modifications that you may need to make. You're in pathway B. And then we have a pathway C where there's substantial deviations. The idea is you still need to get to net zero by 2050, so you're not off the hook, but maybe there's some really unique considerations either because of the industry or because of the building itself. And so we wanted to build in a pathway in that case. And so in the case of hospitals, there were actually several things that we built into the legislation to accommodate but that need for flexibility. So one, there is a unique greenhouse gas intensity target for hospitals. Two, a lot of hospitals operate in kind of a campus format. So there's flexibility around how an owner-operator of several buildings can decide when to decarbonize and in what order, and maybe not doing each building on the cycle, but doing one building intensively in this cycle and then holding off on other buildings. So that's an option for hospitals. The continuous operations issue was one that we heard loud and clear. And so that is a way to be in pathway C, where you submit basically a custom decarbonization plan on how you are going to be able to decarbonize your facilities based on these needs, like needing to keep particular wings open, say, or run research. We have research hospitals in Seattle. And so then the final issue as well was, and suddenly I've lost it. But there's another flexibility for hospitals in there. Read the regulation, it's fascinating. So anyway, it's just to say that as we were refining this legislation, there were really specific operations issues that we were encountering that our partners were saying, we're not going to be able to do this unless we're able to accommodate these really particular specific issues related to our own industry and our own operating environment. So those are some of the ways that we're hoping that this will actually work. Because at the end of the day, the interest for the city is we want to help building owners actually get to decarbonization. Like, the win here is that we're decarbonized, not that you're complying with a regulation for the sake of complying with a regulation. So it really is important to us to be able to be responsive to the specific nuances and needs of a particular industry.
That's incredible from a methodological perspective. I wanted to flag in here quickly on. It's so interesting, and it's awesome to hear how you guys engage healthcare facilities and how you guys are focusing on this and the work that Providence is doing. I'm from New York, so we have the additional challenge of how do you not only figure out how to decarbonize the hospital's facilities, but under Obamacare, the healthcare systems have even financial responsibility for the public health outcomes in the zip code surrounding the hospital. So in the Bronx, in New York, you have the highest childhood asthma rate of anywhere in America, in the poorest congressional district of anywhere in America. And part of the reason for that is you have 5,000 apartment complexes that burn literal oil for heat and hot water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like a truck filled with oil pulls up, pumps it in the basement, you burn it, produce hot water and heat and steam. And so that produces a ton of pollution outside the buildings, but also inside the buildings. And one of our first BlocPower projects back in 2014, we were working in 6 schools. 75% of the kids had chronic asthma in an elementary school. The school nurse had Ziploc bags filled with asthma inhalers for all the 4 and 5-year-olds, and she would have a piece of masking tape with the kid's name on it, because a 4-year-old doesn't know which inhaler is theirs, particularly when they're having an asthma attack. So the nurses and teachers have to have a system for figuring this out. And in our first project, we actually had like a 5-year-old kid die of an asthma attack. Like, as we were doing the diagnostics and feasibility analysis, he had persistent asthma attacks. He was en route to the emergency room. His asthma attack stopped. And his parents were like, oh, okay, maybe we can take him back to school and like we'll go back to work so we don't get fired. And like they took him home and he died, right? So a lot of stuff is like life and death. But also in New York with our healthcare facilities, in the Bronx, because there's such high rates of chronic childhood asthma, I mean, it's horrible for the kids, it's horrible for the families from a public health perspective, but it's also horrible for the healthcare system, whose emergency room is constantly treating chronic childhood asthma patients at a really high cost to the system and to the insurance companies and to taxpayers who pay for Medicaid and Medicare. And so part of the question was, how could the healthcare system start to co-invest in decarbonizing the buildings in their healthcare footprint? So like Montefiore in the Bronx is like, all right, here's like the 500 apartment buildings where we are seeing the most kids with asthma come into our emergency room. Could you go please like decarbonize those buildings first? And we may end up saving some money through lowering emergency room visitation. So is there a mechanism for the healthcare system to co-invest not only in decarbonizing its own buildings, but also decarbonizing the local buildings in the community, right? And so to push a little bit further, right, like how do we think about potentially healthcare buildings as a platform, not only to decarbonize themselves while continuing to operate, which is hard enough, but also to decarbonize the buildings and the community surrounding it?
Kara, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's the challenge, right? We do know, hospitals and healthcare is a large contributor to greenhouse gases. We also have to keep in mind that our patient care is our utmost reason for existence. I do think that there are health systems and hospitals around the nation who are doing some of the work that you're talking about. There's examples in Cleveland, there's examples in DC. And so I think that's really important. I think one of the things that I saw from the study that we did was just the collaboration that we were able to do with Providence was super important. I think I look at Providence and they have this philosophy that they're going to share whatever that the work that they've done. And so I think that's super important, especially when we're faced with these challenges. And I was really appreciative of that. So it is a cycle. It is kind of a vicious circle, I guess. You get more patients in hospitals, which you have more carbon emissions, which you have more climate events, and then you have more patients that have to go back into the hospitals. So I think the real goal is to keep patients out of the hospitals. But we also have to keep in mind that this is a very challenging group of buildings to work with, and it's a challenging situation for them to have to decarbonize. So.
I think you raise a really interesting point, Donnel, on the information that hospitals may have about not just their own operations, but the communities that they're engaging with and what we can be doing with that information. And I wonder, Jessyn, are there any other industries or other examples you've seen in Seattle where there's information that's being garnered through operations that's actually helping not just decarbonize their operations, but the broader community or insights that might be gained?
So I think, the big picture for building decarbonization is that multiple benefits around, human health, the health of the people who are in the buildings and outside of the buildings nearby. For us in Seattle, there was a really strong workforce component. Labor was a really important partner in getting this legislation passed because it is part of that transition to a green economy, the creation of really good paying jobs. So that was a really important benefit. And then, of course, the benefits broadly of decarbonizing. And so we really kind of started from that multiple benefits for people, and that's why we do this. Buildings are places where people exist in and go in, and so that really was kind of the animating principle for us. Like, how are we developing this in a way that creates multiple benefits? And so, again, just as we did with the hospital industry, really spending time listening to other sectors. We spent a lot of time working with small restaurants that may be housed in larger buildings that are being regulated. There was a lot of concern around what happens with our operations around, gas cook stoves. People love their gas cook stoves, and we decided that we would create some flexibility for that, in part to give people time to learn more about induction stoves. I was talking to the sustainability director at Microsoft last night. They've been a partner with us in running some pilots around the use of induction stoves, but we wanted to allow particularly small business owners, particularly immigrant-owned businesses, just to have some flexibility and time to take on these potential new investments. And so that was a way that we built in additional flexibility, and we're also being very deliberate, like I said, in running pilots so that we can learn more about how we can support the adoption of what is still a fairly new and can be expensive technology. Another thing we heard a lot from is under-resourced buildings. We are asking building owners to make a significant investment in their assets, and not all building owners are resourced the same. So we've done now 40 partnerships with smaller organizations like the Wing Luke Museum or the Pike Place Market, and then larger entities like Unico to really help do things like technical analysis. In some cases, we will be partnering with outright funding, thanks to the IRA, thanks to the Climate Commitment Act in Washington State. And so we're really prioritizing under-resourced buildings. The affordable housing community has a set of challenges. So we really focused on kind of deep listening, community expertise, the expertise of building owners, and then trying to incorporate that in a way that, again, balances the standardization, because it has to be a standardized regulation, but with recognizing that not just individual buildings, but different sectors have different needs. And so,
Donnel, do you see that a lot where building owners don't have the resources they need to be doing this work? And what gets them those resources? Is it policy? Is it new technologies? Like what do you need?
Money. I think.
But where does the money come from?
Well, money and data and engineering and workforce development, actually. So you think of the 4 buckets. We started our company 10 years ago to focus on medium-sized buildings. So every building that's not big enough to be a skyscraper, but bigger than a single-family home. There's actually, including hospitals, there's actually 5 million of these buildings in America out of the 125 million buildings that we have. There's like 300,000 skyscrapers, 120 million single-family homes, and then there's these like 5 million medium-sized buildings in between: churches, synagogues, mosques, schools, restaurants, small businesses, hospitals. And these buildings are super expensive to diagnose and analyze to figure out what the sustainability plan should be. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to figure out, to even plan how to do a net zero plan in a hospital. And then it costs more hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a construction analysis to tell you if the net zero plan that the engineers came up with is feasible to a construction contractor who just has a totally different perspective on the project. And that upfront cost of analysis has been a huge barrier for the entire industry. It's going to cost several $1 trillion, depending on who you ask, $2 to $3 trillion, to green these 5 million medium-sized buildings just in America. And even if Bernie Sanders' Senate bill for the IRA and the $6 trillion went through, like, it's just massive amounts of capital are required up front to make this investment. In the clean energy transition that we must make, right, we have to do it. So where does the money come from? So we think there's a mix of like Silicon Valley money and data and Wall Street money and data that is necessary to create the capital stack that can be leveraged with federal IRA dollars. And so, you know, we're creating these national green banks with $27 billion from the EPA. I think I'm on the board of one. I am. Coffee's kicking in. So, we're getting $5 billion to create this bank, but we have to leverage that $5 billion 7-to-1 with money from the capital markets in order to scale it and make the investment. But even that is a drop in the bucket against the broader $2 to $3 trillion that we need. So part of the question is, how do you use AI in a useful way? Not just so kids can write their term papers without actually having to write it, and not just to build up a bunch of data centers that, along with cryptocurrency, are going to further exacerbate the cooking of the planet, because now we're building massive data centers without a clean energy power source, and so we're running them off of gas and accelerating emissions across the country. How can you use generative AI and the breakthroughs to actually help reduce the cost of the feasibility analysis of sustainability in buildings? And so most of us have heard of large language models, where you scrape all the data from the internet and create a language model and a chatbot that can tell you what to do next. So what we've been building, and since I'm in Seattle, I should say, with Jeff Bezos' money, he donated a couple $1 million to help us build this model with the Department of Energy. It's a large infrastructure model. So you have a map of all of the infrastructure in the United States, like all the buildings, all the energy infrastructure, all the pipes, all the wires, all the lines, all the permitting data, all the property tax assessment data for all the infrastructure in the country. And how do you get to a point where, like your chatbot for a large language model, you can type in a building's address and the AI is telling you what the sustainability plan should be for that building, what the net zero plan should be for that building through that large infrastructure model, right? And so can you then reduce 20, 30% of the $2 trillion that we need to make that investment? That said, in terms of action planning, we were talking briefly this morning, like we have this cool project in LA. LA is preparing for the Olympics and World Cup and other sorts of things. And so we're doing a city scale and county scale EV charging infrastructure project for working class and low income folks. A lot of them drive for Uber and Lyft who need to have access to charging at home, because they don't live in a single family home. They live in an apartment complex or low income building. And they need to be able to charge up at night so that they don't have to stop and wait in line at a charger during the day and charge up for 4 hours. That's when they're supposed to be working and making money, right? So you have a problem converting the Uber and Lyft vehicle fleet to an all-electric fleet if you don't have charging infrastructure. And so as an example of the kind of public-private interworking of dollars, so we have like $100 million from a Wall Street bank. We have about $30 million of IRA money or infrastructure bill money that the city and county has allocated. We're going to use the $100 million, buy $50 million worth of chargers and $50 million worth of electric wiring upgrades to support the chargers in apartment complexes across Los Angeles in the parking lots. And then, the other $50 million pays for the workers and the unions to show up and actually do the labor. And if the whole project works and functions, then the tens of millions of dollars of Inflation Reduction Act subsidies show up to pay for the project, right? So we as private sector entities take on the risk using Wall Street capital and Silicon Valley money to pay for the diagnostics. We're not going to persuade the government, hey, we've got this new AI tool, you should give us $50 million. We don't think it's going to work. But we'll take on the risk and come in and do it and install all the chargers and make sure that the drivers can charge up overnight and get it going. And then if it works, then the subsidies come in to repay us to make it a profitable project so that we can then recycle that money and then bring that $100 million up to Seattle and try to duplicate the project here. So that's how we're thinking about it now. But we do need far more capital and data and workforce. We're missing a generation of skilled workers. These are the elements of what's going to be needed to actually get us all to our net zero goals.
Kara, we have just 2 more minutes left. So give us a couple of other takeaways. You've worked in sustainability efforts in hospitals for many years. What can other industries learn from hospitals as they think about how they tackle and prepare for the changing climate and how they operationalize sustainability in their operations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when we look at our hospitals, they are very unique, but they are the leaders of their communities. They're often the largest employers of the communities. And they're also running on very low margins. And so there are other challenges financially since the pandemic. They were running on negative margins until about last year. I think it was like Q3 of last year, they finally broke even. So it's, just thinking about, what it's going to take is there's a lot to consider there in terms of the financial impacts. I think that we are seeing a movement that more hospitals are wanting to do this type of work. We encourage them if they want to, and we have tools and resources available to help them on their journey. I think we need to keep in mind that this is a long journey, and there is a very long runway to get there. We want to get there, but it's going to take a little while, and it's going to take a lot of good planning. So I think that we have leaders, we have systems like Providence Health that are really leading the way. They're sharing their knowledge, they're sharing their own learnings and case studies, which is what we get to do. And I think just learning from each other is one of the biggest pieces of this, and working together.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for letting us learn from the three of you this morning. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you all so much again for being here this morning, and thank you to Providence for sponsoring our breakout and for sponsoring the festival. We are excited to see you at our main stage programming, which starts in 15 minutes. So finish up your cups of coffee, head out. We are excited for a big day ahead. Thanks again for being here.